hand over to Gerry. Over to you, Gerry.
Right, thank you, Alim. I was just about to say good morning, all. It's not morning anymore, is it? Good afternoon, everyone. There's a couple of faces there I recognize already from previous sessions. Right, I'm Gerry Steinhauer, and I'm going to be taking you through this session. Now, my sidekick, Victor, hasn't made it in yet. So when Victor gets here, or before Victor gets here, I'll tell you, Victor is equally as experienced as I am. He's supporting on this particular session. I've supported him on sessions. So, you know, we understand each other and we work synonymously. Okay. My background, I've been doing this for a very long time. You can probably tell from the bags under my eyes and things like that. And I've got a wealth of knowledge about all of this. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask them. Please do ask them in the chat. Okay. Now, if everybody's ready, should we start? Okay. Now, I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And there we go. You should all now see a big blue splodge in the middle of your screen. Okay, and it has a statement on there: project management and agile, incompatible or indispensable. Now, I've got a question for you. And to do this, I'm going to stop sharing the screen for a second, and I'm going to come back to the main screen, because what I'd like you to do is I'm going to ask which of you actually think that this is incompatible. Just as a show of hands, how many of you think that project management and agile are not compatible? Ready? Go.
So I can't see any hands there.
I can't see any hands there at all.
Yeah.
Right. So the answer, therefore, is that they must be compatible. Okay, it's a good start, isn't it? So let's get back to the screen share. Okay, so we're back. So they're not indispensable. They're not incompatible. Therefore, does that mean that they're indispensable? Potentially, yes. Okay. You know, project management and agile. The bottom line here is the project management and agile. Traditional project management has a basic underpinning, and that underpinning is a model that was developed in the 70s by a guy called Winston Royce, and was subsequently dubbed waterfall. And waterfall underpins all of this because waterfall defines the steps or stages or whatever you want to call them that any project management approach has to go through to deliver its output or its outcomes. Now, the interesting thing is, Agile has exactly the same basic steps. So given that they have the same basic core, that leads me to have worked on the basis for years that not only are they compatible, but in the right circumstances, they become indispensable as well. Okay. Can we make them work together? In my view, absolutely yes. And it's been my experience over the years, and I go back to way before Agile even became an entity. The Agile methods were around back then. In fact, Winston Royce's original paper in 1970, when you read it fully, you'll see that what he was advocating was essentially the communication and collaboration aspects that you find in modern day Agile anyway. Okay, so can we make them work together? Absolutely, yes we can. Now, some of you who've been on the previous sessions will recognize this slide. Slightly different focus on it this time. right? The waterfall model, if you look at the bottom left, you've got your opportunity or your need. Okay, business as usual. You know, every opportunity, every need that any organization comes up with is based on what they currently do. It has to be. You know, they're not going to throw it all out the window and start again. So it's going to be based on what they currently have. At the top right, you've got the vision. That is the intended goal for dealing with that opportunity or need. And then in the center, you've got those steps: define, design, build, test, deploy, and maintain. Now, before anyone says, well, that's not waterfall as I understand it, what I've done is I've minimized it. Okay, on the next slide, you'll see it minimized even further, right? But these are the core steps that you're going to go through. You're going to go through a definition process. The definition process is looking at that opportunity or need based on your business as usual, and it's going to come up with a vision. That then, if we're talking about traditional project management, will be fed down into the project team in the way in the form of some kind of mandate. This is your kickstart for your project. Okay. One of the challenges that you find with this is that definition is often done at a more senior level in the organization. Now, here's contentious statement number one. How often have you been involved in projects where it's come down from the top, and when you actually see that project or see what's being requested, you look at it and think, they haven't got a clue. They don't know what's happening down at the shop floor. Okay? Assuming you can get past that, you then go into the middle section, you know, the orange bits, and you're going into a design process, a build process, a test, and a deploy process. Okay? Now, again, in traditional project management terms, this is the meat of the project. And then ultimately, you deploy and you go out into a maintenance stage of the project. This is the project has now gone live, the output has now gone live, and it's being used. And somebody or some group is now maintaining it, which has fed it straight back into business as usual. Okay? Now, I'm hoping that this is all making sense. Now, when you look at this in an agile perspective, exactly the same thing happens. The only difference is, and here I'm going to try and use the pointer to see whether this actually works. Pointer options, I'm going to use the pen. What's actually happening is that design and build and test and deploy, they skip backwards and forwards throughout the agile process. They're not separate as they would be in the traditional application of waterfall, but they're interlinked. Now, I'm still hoping that this makes sense. If not, I'll expect a whole pile of questions. Okay, so they are interlinked. So there's nothing preventing you from going into design at the same time you're building a prototype based on that emerging design, and you're testing that prototype, and then at a fairly rapid juncture, you're going out to deploy as well. You're deploying quickly. Okay. Now, this is all these links here are all about communication and collaboration. And that's what Agile is really about, is getting that communication and collaboration right, and doing all of this at the same time. It's all taking place within a very shortened cycle. Okay. Now, moving this on to the next slide and looking at that. Right. So you've now got at the top half, you've got define, build, release. I said I've minimized it even further. So the define is your kickstart. This is where all of the upfront stuff is done. That takes you into your build stages for your project. Then ultimately, that release stage will release this value over here. Okay. Now, over time, the Agile approach takes you through define, build, and release, the same steps, but you are getting early release. You are potentially getting early return on your investment. And I've got 3 steps down here. It could be 23. Doesn't matter. You know, these steps, each of these will be 1 to 4 weeks in duration. Now, it can be quicker than that. I mean, if you think that Amazon apparently go through about 3 releases a day. All right. So it can be very, very effective, very rapid, but you're getting early feedback. Now, think about risk in this context, right? In the traditional approach, and I'm going to change the pointer now to a highlighter. Think about risk. Risk in the traditional approach tends to bring you along this kind of plane. And you start seeing, as you're getting towards release, your risk gets higher. And that is because you haven't really done any releasing down here, so you don't know how well this is going to work until you get that big bang at the end. Does that make sense? Whereas down here, and now I've got a problem because I've got to move all the screenshots up to the top of the page. So down here, your risk plane is quite different. You get this kind of approach, right? You flattened out that risk curve. You don't get that big spike at the end, right? Now, it doesn't take, to my mind anyway, it doesn't take an Einstein to look at that and think, do you know what? These are similar, but look at the benefits that we've got down below. We've got early feedback, early return on investment through these rapid staged deployments all the way through, or releases all the way through. So we're getting value out there quickly. But they work on the same basic parameters. So why can't we combine them? Okay, so combining them flattens out that risk curve. You still get the same value at the end. No difference. But that value at the end, if you use the Agile approach within that project management approach, what you actually get is value that has been quantified and assessed by the customer here and here, all the way through the project. So they know exactly what they're getting, and they're getting more of an opportunity to change and amend things on the way through. Okay. Now, I'm hoping that has all made sense. And what I've asked Aline to do is see how many questions we've got coming through based on what you've seen so far before we go to the next stage. And we'll take some of those questions now.
So Gerry, as things stand, there's been commentary and people making points, but no questions as I can see in the chat. But while I'm speaking, let's see if there's anyone that wants to ask a question verbally. Otherwise, as you say, we can move on. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask Gerry a question based on what they've heard so far?
Aline, it's Simon. Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Hiya. One of the kind of really common causes of projects going wrong is having incomplete or poorly defined requirements. But with Agile, you're actually doing a lot of development while those requirements are still being pulled together.
Yeah.
How do you manage the risk of, potentially you've done a whole load of development and then you suddenly discover there's some fundamental piece of design that you've got wrong because a new requirement emerged that, effectively means you end up having to rework all of it?
You have that problem in both approaches, because one of the challenges with the traditional project management approach is exactly what you just defined there, Simon. This definition up front is based on, to a large degree, guesswork and assumption. You have to assume things to get those plans up and built, and then you don't really get validation of that plan until you get to the end of the process. In an agile sense, you're going through a similar process, but you're defining at a high level, and you're pulling together a product backlog. And that product backlog is being verified by the customer before you start. And it's being verified by the customer all the way through. So yes, you can still get the same problem, but bearing in mind what I've been saying here about these early releases, at the end of each of these sprint cycles, for argument's sake, you've got a review by the customer before it's released. So the customer gets an opportunity to look at and vet what is about to be released much earlier than they do in the traditional sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat, I think.
Yeah.
So
I'm happy to debate that further, but we've only got limited time here.
I was going to see if Victor had a point as well. So Victor joined.
Yeah.
So go on, Victor.
Yeah. I think what the reason we're going to have less of that problem in an agile environment is because virtually all agile environments use a feedback loop with the customer. The simplest being build, measure, learn. Build, measure, learn. Yeah. How do we do that? We go back to the customer. And because we're going back to the customer quite regularly, we minimize the risk of delivering the wrong thing. Hence, as Gerry has said, we have a flattened risk profile in the agile environment compared to the traditional. So it's that constant feedback loop. And all agile environments try to shorten that feedback loop.
Yeah. Thank you, Victor, and welcome.
Yeah. And Simon, if you
sincere apologies, I had technical issues, but I don't want to. I'll be sending my laptop back to HP later tomorrow or something. Yeah.
So Simon, if you want to discuss that further, then as you know, both Gerry and Victor are on the Slack channel and are making their time available to all. If I could just use this opportunity to bring Steve on. Steve had a question as well. That would be best if he asked it verbally. Steve?
Hey guys, thank you, Alan. So I often see Agile being discussed and explained in the context of some sort of software development, changing the user interface. I want to make it blue instead of yellow, whatever the case may be. But actually, in the context of developing a product that is physical hardware, mechanical, electronics, built-in firmware, and then software that might be used to interact with it, I've heard this week timescales for these loops, these iterations being 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. The spin of a PCB or some new mechanics might take 2 months. So how do you reconcile kind of agile with the timescales it takes to spin hardware as much as software?
Victor, I can see you've got a big smile on your face. Do you want to take this one first?
Hey, thanks, Gerry. I think this is the sort of typical impact we see of Scrum on the agile environment. A lot of the time, people will hear agile and they think Scrum, which has been, it remains a fantastic delivery mechanism. But when we refer to agile here, it's a whole family of frameworks. So if working in 2-week sprints, 3-week sprints doesn't work, hey, we've got Kanban. which will manage the flow of the development of that product. We've got other frameworks that we can use. So when we say Agile here, please, it's not just Scrum. So not all Agile environments rely on short sprints of 2 weeks. And I think we just need to broaden that term, recognize that we're using that term in a broadened, collective family of frameworks. Gerry.
Yeah, totally agree, Victor. The other thing is Scrum is very simplistic. The Scrum guide is very simplistic, and it's called a guide for a reason. It is not a set of rules.
That's right.
The 2 to 4 week time frame is a recommendation because that is how it works most effectively in a lot of situations. But if you have a situation where you need a 6 week period, then run a 6 week period. But maybe 3 weeks in, take a review. It is as flexible as you need to make it.
Do you mind if I ask
your requirements?
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question? And I guess what I'm looking for is a yes or no.
Yeah, go on.
So the whole concept of small chunks of work that you can rapidly define, build, test it, and release it makes a lot of sense. I've had a client who has started with this journey of Agile and to some extent Scrum, and they have refused to acknowledge the need for a vision, an all-encompassing plan of where they're starting and where they want to end up. As a consequence, each twist of the Agile circle there, define, build, release, they could turn left a bit more, and before they know it, they're back at the beginning, and they've actually not got to the end of the journey.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing is there's a methodology for the way you work, Agile, Scrum, but layered on top of that, there should be a framework of some description that allows you to envision and realize kind of what your overarching plan is from A to B, but how you get there is completely flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you an analogy. If you get into your car first thing in the morning, you turn on the engine, sat nav pops up, and you start driving. Where's your sat nav taking you? Absolutely bloody nowhere. At best, it's showing you which road you're on. At worst, it's taking you back to the last location it had stored, which is back to your driveway. Okay, you need to tell that sat nav where you want to go, and that analogy to me encapsulates all of this. If you don't know where you're going, how will you know when you get there? So you have to have that vision up front. You have to have that goal in sight. And yeah,
sorry, Gerry, go on. Sorry.
In order to do this, you need to go through a planning process. That planning process is no different for Agile than it is for traditional Prince2, for example. You're going to start by defining the major steps that will get you to that goal. Once you have those major steps, very often in the traditional sense, then you start theorizing and guessing your way to a conclusion. In an Agile sense, what tends to happen, and what I make sure happens, is that you go back to the stakeholders saying, here's the major steps, now you fill in the blanks. And you've given them something to get hold of. And you're asking them to fill in the blanks. That is how you define your product backlog. And that product backlog is what takes you through the Agile process. And that product backlog works equally as well in the traditional environment.
So Gerry and Victor, there are more questions in the chat, but we'll save them for the Q&A later. So for those of you that have posted in chat, please keep doing so. They're not forgotten. But just to move us on, apart from, just before I get you to progress, Dawn had herself unmuted. Dawn, was there something that you wanted to kind of mention with regards to what was being discussed before we move on?
Well, I suppose it was on a slightly different question line to Steve. Mine was more about My experience is more waterfall than agile, and the delivery has mainly been quite complicated technical asks, and not as simple as needing a red button on something, right? So if and in the as I'm sure it is in the same in other industries as well, but if you were only able to deliver part of the features, the clients would be quite unhappy because it would be clunky, right? It wouldn't do what it needed to do fully. And I know that is the premise of Agile, that it's, you know, get features out there, get it done, and do incremental changes. But if you the other side to it is that if you have got quite a lot of complex change for system development, if the developers go down the route of, I don't know, one path, and then later on one of the features, if they had known about that at the beginning, they would have been able to say, actually, we shouldn't have taken that first path that we took for those first set of features, because this additional feature that's adding on in phase 3, say, would have made us do something different, and it's actually going to make it more difficult, or we might have to undo what we've already done. So how do you work that kind of magic, agile magic, around those kind of asks?
The simple answer is the customer is involved day to day throughout.
Okay.
The product owner in the Scrum environment is the voice of the customer. And if the product owner, who is sort of feeding back to the customers all the time, or should be, comes across a new requirement or an additional requirement that's come through in the light of what they're seeing, then that gets fed into the process, and it's fed into that product backlog as an extra requirement, and you pay for it by dropping a lower priority requirement. So it's fed in as it occurs. And if that means that you have to rework some of the subsequent requirements because this one has changed the parameters slightly, then that will happen.
What about if it changes the earlier requirements?
Well, if it does, then you deal with it. Because again, you get exactly the same thing in the traditional approach. If something comes along and it's a major change, then you're going to have to rework. The difference is the amount of rework you're going to have to do in the traditional approach is far greater than the amount of rework you need to do here.
Yeah.
Because you'll discover it far earlier here.
Well, actually, I was thinking about a slightly different scenario. I was thinking that it wasn't something that was discovered later on in the process. It was something that was known about, but it wasn't one of the features that was going to be delivered at the beginning, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, but again, it's the point at which that feature is brought in. That's the key. And you can't change that. That feature will be brought in when that spike suddenly hits and somebody goes, "We've got to have this."
Yeah. So let's cover a bit more about this at the end then. So just to move us on, but I think it was covered well anyway, because I completely agree with you, Gerry, about dealing with it and knowing about it sooner. As I said, there are some other questions in the chat, but we'll ask them at the end, and we'll come back to this point at the end if we need to as well. So back to you, Gerry.
Okay, right. So just moving on through the remainder of this. So what exactly is project management? It's nothing more than a method of achieving a stated goal, and we're trying to control the process as best we can. Defining what, why, who, how, when, and how much. Anyone involved in projects understands all of this. Why do we do it? Because we want to exercise as much control over what we're doing as we can. The standard elements that we want to control: time, cost, quality, scope, benefits, and risk. Time and cost when you use Agile are fixed. And time and cost in a traditional approach often tend to break. You know, if you get a mandatory requirement, for example, a mandatory change to existing systems, then they will often come with time and cost boundaries already preset. So you've got to get this done within this time frame and without spending any more than this. That works far better in an agile environment than it does in a traditional environment, because agile is set up to work that way. What does all of this provide? Realistically, it's a nice warm feeling in the pit of senior management stomach that things are under control. Right? Now, using a project management methodology guarantees success. Oh, really? You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, what I've done is I've gone online and I've looked at statistics. There are lots of statistics on project success rates and things online. The top one is an interesting one. Just 40% of projects at IBM meet the company's 3 goals: schedule, budget, and quality. Time, cost, quality. And that's from IBM. Now, the way that that's couched, it makes it sound like IBM's internal projects. This isn't. This is IBM's external projects. But you have to read the whole thing to see that. So it doesn't mean that they've all failed. It means that they've had difficulties on one of those elements. Okay, so time, cost, or quality. The next one, 70% of projects fail. Standard. It's a standard failure rate out there. 50% of projects fail due to breakdown in communications. The biggest killer out there is communications. And one thing that Agile brings to the party is live, interactive, collaborative communication. Only 26% of all projects succeed. That's a nasty statistic. Okay. Moving on, why so much failure? Key factors. Poor communication, the biggest killer. And it has been as long as I've been involved in projects. Communication has always been the #1 factor. Assumptions and guesswork up front, the Big Bang approach. Predefining everything, coming up with the plan, and then refusing to change that plan in the light of evidence. No, this is how we planned it, this is what we're going to do. And if we have to, then we'll have phase 2 to put things right. Stakeholders not engaged. Stakeholders tend to be an afterthought a lot of the time. Yeah, we've asked them the questions up front, we asked them what they wanted, and now we're delivering it. Why do we need to go and ask them again? They'll be happy with what they've asked for. Right. If your project is 2 years in length, how likely is it that your final solution, which was defined 2 years earlier, is going to meet market requirements and therefore make your stakeholders happy? Lack of leadership. Often categorized by the kind of approach that says, there you go, there's your project, get on with it, tell us when it's finished. Constantly changing priorities. Changing priorities is a big issue in a traditional style project, because for the factors we were talking about earlier, the rework cycles, they're much bigger. It's less of a factor if you're using an agile delivery mechanism. So, coming to agile, what is it? It's a mindset rather than a laid down list of instructions. It's a mental approach to getting things right. Delivering product rapidly and accurately. Yeah, the early release cycles give you that accuracy because you're getting verification all the way through. focuses on delivering full products in bite-sized chunks. You know, the old saying about how do you eat an elephant, you know, if you went to a restaurant and they're there on the table, there's your elephant, and you're told that's what you're eating, how would you do it? A bite at a time. Okay? Continual assessment of progress and requirements. You've got this ongoing assessment. And when I talk about ongoing assessment, I'm not just talking about the release cycle, the potentially shippable product at the end of each sprint. I'm talking about the development process within the sprint process. And as developer one picks up an item, a task, and then gets to the end of that development for that task and says, I'm done, it goes into test straight away. And that test is, as far as I'm concerned, should not be just, does it integrate in system terms, but also, does it meet the user's specifications, the user's requirements? So you've got verification from both sides all the way through. And finally, it enables and emphasizes change as a necessary part of development. Change is not the bad guy here. Change is actually good. So using Agile guarantees success to a degree. But, you know, this diagram where we're seeing waterfall here, this is from the Standish Chaos reports. And they categorize waterfall as effectively traditional project management. And looking at their statistics, this is the latest set of statistics that they've produced. They've been producing statistics since 2002. And they don't produce a set of statistics every year, it's every couple of years. Successful, Agile 42%, Waterfall 26%. Now, we've got approaching 2-to-1. Challenged, very similar. Failed, approaching 3-to-1 higher failure, 3-to-1 times higher failure rate with Waterfall than with Agile. Okay. Now, Agile failures. Lack of understanding of what Agile actually is. I've seen so many organizations where they've got Agile. Yeah, we've gone Agile. What does that mean? Well, we've got those guys in the corner. They're doing Agile. What are they doing? Well, we're not sure. When are they going to deliver? We're not sure. How are they doing it? We don't know. So how do you expect to get what you need? Okay, if you're going to adopt Agile, then adopt it properly. Make sure you understand what it is, and then apply that understanding across the organization. Lack of buy-in at senior management level. Sometimes Agile's come in through the back door and it's just happening. Senior management don't know about it. Sometimes senior management don't care as long as it produces results. Buy-in at stakeholder level is a key. One of the keys to any Agile approach is that you need the business to be involved in the development process. If they just take a back seat and say, get on with it, don't be surprised if you don't get, or if they don't get the results that they wanted. They have to be part of the process. The major decisions, you know, major changes and what have you in the Agile process or in the Agile delivery, what's being delivered should be passed by the stakeholders. Teams unwilling to adopt Agile practices. Not everybody wants to work in an environment where A, they're constantly on point, constantly being asked to produce, and B, they have to stand up and say, today I'm going to do this. They have to commit. Okay. And last one, teams not getting Agile training. There's an urban myth out there that you don't need to be trained in Agile. It's common sense. Yeah, it is common sense. Unfortunately, common sense isn't common. So, you know, invest in your teams. Get them trained so that they are effective from the start. Sorry. so that they're effective from the start. And finally, why combine them? Okay, project management, what does it lack? It lacks a recognized development method. You know, project management often views development as a necessary evil. That's what happens down at the team level. So we'll plan it all down to there and they get on with it. And we'll set them targets. Project management is traditionally strong on governance, though. It's very good at the interface between senior management and the project and how to report and things like that, how to control. Agile, on the other hand, often isolated from governance because it's seen as a development mechanism. It's more than that, or should be. You know, it doesn't just deliver local rather than organizational level need. It's exceptionally strong in delivering quickly, accurately, and within time and cost parameters. If you get the Agile approach right, you'll always hit your time and cost targets. And you'll do it by trading low value items for higher value items as they become apparent. And when you combine them, what have you done? You've effectively cancelled out both approaches' weaknesses. Agile doesn't play well at the corporate level. Prince2 or whatever does. The traditional project method doesn't play too well at the delivery level. Agile does. You put them together, get it right, you've got rocket fuel. And that is the end of that. I've got a couple of slides to illustrate things if I need them, but we're now at the end of the session and we're into questions.
Great, thanks, Gerry. So this is the point before we get to the questions where if I can ask you to play your part and turn your cameras on, please, and just give us a wave. Just take up 10 seconds of your time. So thank you for that. And now you've more than earned your questions being answered. Okay, so thank you so much. So look, Gerry, there's a few questions which are actually quite long in the question. Okay, so with those, I will come to them, but I'll also post them in the chat because sometimes it's easier to answer when you can see the question, right? But I'll start off with some easy ones. Okay, so some gentle ones.
Thank you, Alim.
All right. So the first question is, and it was from a while back. It's how do you manage scope creep and the budget management? So the finances and scope creep. How do you handle that? Some practical examples, please.
Okay. Take you back to what I was saying earlier. Then, when you're setting up your project, your product backlog, in an Agile sense, start with a roadmap, the major product groupings. Take that back to the stakeholders, ask them to fill in the gaps. Once they've filled in the gaps, they're giving you the more detailed view of how you're going to get from one end to the other. You then get that categorized. Use Moscow, for example. You know, must have, should have, could have, won't have. The must-haves are your critical path. They have to be delivered. Therefore, the shoulds and the coulds effectively become contingency. And that is how you prevent scope creep. Because with the Agile approach, you will trade off lower value items to introduce new higher value items or amend existing higher value items. And if you get this right, and you take the traditional statistics that you get out of something like DSTM, your must-haves shouldn't really be higher than about 60% of the total effort involved. That gives you 40% contingency. And that's how you get rid of scope creep.
Okay, and just related to that then, so another question was to do with managing your stakeholders. So while you're trying to do the Moscow, if you have conflicting stakeholders, how do you reconcile between them? And there is a session on stakeholder management that Dev is leading on Monday. So for anyone that wants a more in-depth look at stakeholder management, please join his session. But Gerry, a brief answer on
okay, stakeholder management If you're using an agile approach, they manage themselves because they're managing what's being delivered. They're in control of it. So they are managing their own requirements. Stakeholder management isn't really an issue in an agile sense if you get it right. When you get it wrong as an organization, then it becomes a big issue, because if you're not getting the stakeholders involved, then you're guessing on their behalf. Okay, so you have to make sure that customers or the stakeholders are engaged in the process from start to finish. Okay, Victor, do you want to add to that?
I guess the only thing I'd add to that is back to the communications problem. It's also the way we engage with them, how early we engage with them, and how we then communicate with them subsequently. And if our communication with them is defective or ineffective, rather I should say, earlier on, then we're in trouble. And so that goes to the heart of why communication is a major source of failure. So when we have clients who do not understand why we need to get feedback from them within 2 weeks, well, maybe we should have engaged with them much earlier on to say, here's how we work in an agile environment. We're going to need you to commit to regular feedback. If they didn't know that before and you spring that on them, this is where the problems arise. Yeah.
And equally, this is where senior management have a major role to play as well.
That's correct. Yeah.
Senior management need to make sure that the organization is optimized for this to happen.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So this question then, so it's a bit worthy. So I'm posting in the chat, but I will ask it as well. Okay, so I'm just posting in the chat now. So a question was asked: if a project is prolonged through agile process and budget is being reached, is there a higher risk of quality being compromised? And if so, how can all factors be better controlled to avoid project quality or features being compromised without needing to go back to the customer asking for more money? So this is using agile, but it's prolonged, they've hit some kind of issue. How do they manage that?
Okay, well, first thing I'll say to this is there is no silver bullet out there. There's nothing that will deliver exactly what you want and exactly the way you want it if something external comes into play. Okay, the key here is that compromise. If something comes in and it says you've got to change the quality of existing requirements, then you have to change them. And that doesn't matter whether you're using agile or traditional methods. You are still in that compromise situation. What you have with agile is an effective method of controlling it. What you have with traditional methods is an effective way of managing it. Okay, use them in conjunction and they will get you there normally. And I go back to my point earlier about the 60-40 split as well. If you've got your 60% critical path and the remainder is shoulds and coulds, you've got a contingency buffer there, which should see you through most situations. Okay, sometimes you have to go back to senior management and say, something's come up, we need to refocus. We can't do it.
Okay, thanks, Gerry. That answer. So look, I've posted the next one. So it's long, right? So there's a bit of text there, but I'm going to try and summarize. So it's all about culture, I think, and the leadership. So I'll read out the question, but you'll see. So formally, this person is saying there's no problem between both methodologies living together. In real life, though, culturally, there is. Where is it? PM is more in control, annoying side by style-wise, while Agile is very much about coaching softish, right? So maybe one autocratic, one democratic.
Yeah.
I'm still not sure that the same person can be a good traditional PM and a good Scrum Master, and or the same team can work in both environments. There is space for change in leadership style, transformation as well. There are differences in perception of failures, plans, risks. I've seen the statistics, as you can see here. So just look, just to sum up, the kind of maybe more autocratic, democratic styles is what's being associated here. What's your message around that and around same teams, etc.?
Well, okay, first things first. PM and Scrum Master cannot be the same person. You're asking too much of that person, because a good Scrum Master is there day to day with the team. How does that allow a PM to be controlling the remainder of the project, all the communications and everything else? And they are totally different focuses as well. So the Scrum Master works with the team. The PM controls the project, controls the activities being carried out. Okay. The differences in perception of failures, plans, and risks, statistics of losing 40%. Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that at all, because, you know, as I said earlier, not everyone will happily work in this environment. I mean, I can give you an example of someone who couldn't. Someone I worked with years ago, who was the best bloody programmer I've ever met in my life. But he was an alcoholic, and he'd go to the pub at lunchtime, and he'd be asleep at his desk in the afternoon, every day. He was so good that we just let him work mornings. You couldn't ask this person to work in an agile team. You know, it just wouldn't work. And you've got people out there who are not able or do not want to stand up and say, hey, I'm going to do this. And what you need in an agile team is people like that. And if it means that you've got to have an agile development arm, and you've got to have a sort of BAU maintenance arm, and the ones who won't stand up and commit tend to do the maintenance, and some of them you're going to lose, then so be it. Because ultimately you will get a far leaner organization in project terms as a result.
Thanks, Gerry. Yeah, but sorry, so Victor, perhaps you will answer the next question, because we have about 5 minutes. We have 2 more questions from the chat still, but instead of going directly to those, I want to just open it up to see if anyone wants to ask a question verbally, if they want to unmute themselves and come back to a point that's already been mentioned, or ask a brand new question before we go back to the chat. Anyone want to unmute themselves? And I see a couple of hands have been raised. So if we go to Shashank Jha first. Do you want to unmute yourself? If that's deliberate, or while we're waiting for Shashank, Steve Forrest, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sorry, I've seen it asked multiple different ways. Just want to be really clear and get a very succinct answer. So Scrum Master is not the product owner. Product manager of all words, I get that. Question is the project manager, Waterfall, the same as Scrum Master, Agile?
No, definitely not. They are focused on different things. The project manager is focused on controlling the project, making sure that all the different elements. I look at the project manager as being a spider in the center of a web, and they're pulling on all these strands to make sure they're all connected to the right space and that they're all working properly. The Scrum Master is much more focused on the delivery of the team. The Scrum Master will be there to facilitate on behalf of the team to make sure that any obstacles that they're encountering are dealt with and got out the way quickly so they can carry on.
Okay, thanks. Who measures progress?
Well, they both do. Because down at the Scrum level, or the Agile level, you've got big visible charts or information radiators or whatever, you know, a wall with all your information on, and it's updated daily. The project manager then comes down to look at this, preferably on a daily basis, so they're getting daily feedback on progress. So they're both measuring it.
And they have different stakeholders potentially, right? So
yeah.
Yep. So let's see if there's anyone else. Shashank?
Yeah. Yes, Alan, thank you. Gerry, quick question. When we are doing a big transformation in Agile, transformation projects in Agile, we see that there are a lot of parallel streams. It creates a lot of parallel streams, and it's difficult to support because some are in release, some are in build, some are in testing, and it's very difficult to estimate and foresee them in the planning session. And so what is your suggestion how to deal with this situation, and where can this be estimated? At what stage it should be estimated that we would need this much of effort in testing or in deployment?
From what you're asking, I would assume that you have a program going on which is spawning lots of projects. Am I right?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, you can call it a project with different functionalities at different stages.
Okay. If you have different functionalities at different stages, you're essentially going to have different teams as well. And yeah, you need to be managing those teams. One accepted method out there is the Scrum of Scrums approach. And they have the daily stand-up within each team. And then the Scrum Masters of those teams get together after those stand-ups are finished to do a Scrum of Scrums, which is another daily stand-up at the Scrum Master level, so that everybody's kept on track with where things are going in each of those streams. And that's one way of dealing with it.
All right. And if it is a program and there are projects, do they still have Scrum of Scrums?
Yeah, they'll still have Scrum of Scrums if you've got multiple projects working on the same program and they need to be kept in sync. But equally, the project manager will have access to all of this information to be able to feed back to the program as well.
All right, thank you.
Victor,
I believe this is where we need to recognize that at the project and program delivery level, there are skills and techniques that we need to learn so that we can manage the environment better when we're using agile and traditional project management methods. We just need to recognize you cannot manage a project the same way. You cannot manage a program the same way you manage a project. So there are techniques in program management and project management we will have to bring in such situations. Yeah.
So one last question, and I think we've hopefully covered everyone. I hope everyone's had a chance to say. So I posted it here in the chat. I think it's an interesting one, so I'll read it. It says, traditional PM approach focusing on following a plan and following a change management plan in case of any changes. On the other hand, Agile in its principles says Agile cannot be planned and give predominant importance to responding to customer than following a plan. So how will these marry in terms of project planning? So no planning in Agile, lots of planning in a waterfall project. Yeah. What's your view on that?
Well, the no planning in Agile is an urban myth spawned by people who don't want to do any planning. I mean, the reality is Agile actually gets more planning, but more focused planning than the traditional project does. Traditional project tends to plan up front and then follow that plan through and trying to avoid changing it. Whereas Agile does plan up front, but it plans at a sort of release level, and the detail is allowed to filter out as you start working in each of those arenas. So you're planning at the detail level constantly in Agile. You're also planning at the higher level up front, and then allowing the detail to fall out. At the traditional level, you're planning up front. So those two are synonymous anyway.
Yeah, completely agree. So look, on that note, Victor, I'll give you 10 seconds to respond as well, but then we're going to have to wrap it up. So it's Victor to you.
Okay, the term I would bring in, which we should all consider to underline what Gerry has said, is the term planning horizon. The planning horizons, how far ahead we plan in Agile, tends to be shorter because we want shorter feedback loops. We want to learn quickly and get to the customer, get feedback quickly, right? Because we have short, sprints, time boxes. The planning horizon at the higher levels will be a bit longer, but even at the higher levels, as Gerry said, you're not going to plan 6 months ahead. Doesn't make sense. right? So we do have planning horizons, and the agile planning horizons are shorter, hence the minimized risk as well. That's all I would add. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Gerry. So look, I'm sure you'd agree they've done a great job. Thank you all for your questions. There are more sessions, one more session today and many more sessions next week. So hope you enjoyed it and speak to you next time round. Thank you.